Alright everyone, today we are going to cover the reigns of Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, though this lecture is going to be mostly about the reign of Elizabeth since she reigned for the longest, for 44 years, and she produced more of the permanent change in English government and society and the Constitution. So let's just recap what happened at the beginning stages of the Reformation. So English Catholicism had sort of several features. Among them, one of them was monasticism, and as we saw with the dissolution of the major and minor monasteries, these monasteries, which used to be around 900 of them throughout all of England, were mostly disbanded and the income seized to the crown. The lands were distributed to various nobles, they were sold, they were appropriated for the crown, and that's why you get sometimes noble manors today called something like something Abbey, or like Downton Abbey, even though that's a fictional one. It's an example of a place that used to be an abbey but then became a lord's manor. Another feature was bishops, so overseers of the church that ordained clergy and administer the fullness of the sacraments. Henry VIII kept them, but they were a contentious issue among Protestants who thought they were unbiblical and they should be replaced by presbyters or elders. That was the doctrine of Calvin and his followers. So the Church of England stays with bishops, does away with monasteries. Ceremony and liturgy also stays the same, grand processions and masses and liturgies with lots of vestments and accoutrements and music sort of remain during the reign of Henry VIII, who remains mostly a Catholic monarch. Please take the handouts. Henry VIII remains a Catholic monarch, but these were seen also by various Protestants as idolatrous, and while they remained with Henry VIII, they would also become a contentious issue in the English Reformation. These occasions were also places for whole villages to sort of showcase who was who, and in case of big cities like London, who were the great dignitaries, depending on your position in the procession, where you were walking, what you were wearing, what you were sitting. It was a religious but also an act of civic unity. Pilgrimages and shrines. Famously, most saints' shrines are suppressed over Henry VIII, especially the ones in monasteries. One that is a particular target of Henry VIII's wrath is the shrine of Thomas Becket, which you can see here, which is a CGI reconstruction because the current shrine no longer survives. Becket, who was a hero of the freedom of the church, of the Libertas Ecclesiae, as we saw in previous classes, was deemed now to have been retroactively a traitor because he went against his king. And under Henry VIII's church, the king being the supreme authority of the church, that is simply inadmissible. So the shrine of Becket is suppressed. The shrine of Edward the Confessor, however, is kept in Westminster Abbey, as do a few other shrines that survive, but most sites of cult and pilgrimage are suppressed. And the Mass, the sort of summit of Catholic worship, where the acts of the Last Supper are recreated and the sacrifice of Christ is said to be reenacted when the blood and when the bread and the wine are transformed into the blood and body of Christ, also remains largely intact during Henry VIII, with vestments, with ceremony, with liturgy. Here are pictures of a reconstruction of a Mass following the rubrics that would have been common during the time of Henry VIII, what's called the use of Sarum, the Sarum use of the Roman Rite, but that would also become quite contentious. And since the monasteries are suppressed, many of them are reduced to ruins, and you can still see some of them like Whitby Abbey, or like the Abbey of Walsingham in England, which was the major shrine of the Virgin Mary, which are reduced to picturesque yet somewhat sad ruins. If they are not converted into estates, sometimes these ruins coexist with the estates that replace them. But when Henry VIII dies in the year 1547, The throne is assumed by a boy scarcely of 9, his only son by his second wife, Jane Seymour, who is Edward VI. Now, since Edward was only a boy of 9, as we've seen in previous lectures, a regency council has to be appointed. He cannot rule by himself. So Henry VIII, in his will, which was also a matter of contention because there are various claims among court factions that it might have been forged, because the king didn't sign it himself, but it was signed with a stamp of his signature. That was actually a very common tactic that Henry VIII used, because he didn't like to sign too many documents. He wasn't as fond of governance as his father was. But the will outlines that a council of regency will be enacted, filled with mostly members of the Seymour, members or allies of the Seymour family, so Edward's maternal family, and a few bishops like Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed by Henry, the same one that annulled his marriage with Anne Boleyn, and his subsequent other marriages. So, the thing about Edward VI is that he, for his entire infancy, has been educated by tutors and by people, mostly of his mother's faction of the Seymours, that are very different from his father in terms of religious belief. These people are staunch Protestants. And there was a growing continental Protestant faction in Henry VIII's court by the end of his life. In fact, his last wife, Catherine Parr, was notoriously very much Protestant, not at all Catholic like Henry, and came very close a couple of times to being declared a traitor and executed because of her beliefs. She actually wrote various theological and prayer books. She was one of the first women in England to publish under her own name, her own books. And that sort of action, which she did under the patronage of the king, but then after the king died, earned her a lot of suspicion. But there was a growing, yet largely silent and begrudgingly Catholic Protestant faction in the king's court. And when the king dies, they have a chance to shape the new king in their image. So you can see here a portrait of Edward. As you can see, evidently a child, even if he is dressed in the manner of his father. We're going to see a lot of portraiture this week because the advent of sort of figural portrait painting and allegorical portrait painting of the Renaissance gives us a window into thought and political ideology and propaganda that previous pieces of medieval art give us. So despite all his kingly accoutrements, he is a boy. He is aided by a regency council. However, he, due to his education, becomes a very opinionated 9 and 10 and subsequently 11-year-old. So the king as well comes to grow as a staunchly Protestant king. Speaking of allegorical paintings, here is one of the most famous of his realm. You can see Edward in the middle, his council on one side and his dying father on the other. And famously, he is using the Pope as his footstool, representing everything that's wrong with the previous religion, everything that's wrong with superstition, with papal supremacy. And you can see in the window several superstitious monuments are being torn down by soldiers, images, things that the Protestants of Edward's faction deem to be blasphemous and unbiblical. So there are pieces like these which are reproduced in various woodcuts and circulated around that make not only a argument in word, in printed word about the king's supremacy over the church and the new Protestant religion, but also a vivid pictorial one. So the Council of the King includes a remarkable man by the name of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. So Cranmer was appointed by Henry VIII to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury. He was appointed as a Catholic archbishop. The Pope allowed him to nominate Cranmer, and the Pope consented to it as a way to extend an olive branch to try to ease the king's growing discontent with Rome. It turns out Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was a budding Lutheran his Protestant views change over his life, but he was a Protestant. He was a Protestant who was secretly married, and who would enact much of Henry VIII's religious reform, and now would enact some of Edward's as well, as he was more theologically aligned by this time with Edward. So the Regency Council of Edward moved Parliament and the realm to further reform the church. So what does this mean? It means that instead of using the Catholic liturgies that had been preserved by Henry VIII, they figure out that the new Church of England needs its own uniform, reformed, standardized, and, crucially, English language prayer book. So Cranmer is tasked with writing the first Book of Common Prayer, which is published in 1549. So this is a little book that summarizes or simplifies the whole cycle of prayer of the Catholic Church, all feast days, all prayers of the daily office, all masses, and fits them into a single volume that can be read by most literate people, and which is in the English language. Now, a problem with the Catholic liturgy at the time, or well, what they saw as a problem, is that it was divided among way too many books, and that the laity did not have access to it because it was arcane and it was not in the English language, it was in Latin. And lay participation in liturgies was minimal. What does Cranmer do? He reduces the offices, he reduces the feast days, he translates everything into English, and he expects everyone else, whether they're clerics or not, to use this prayer book uniformly in all churches in England. Now, there was a problem with the first prayer book, is that it was deemed too Catholic. Cranmer was not perhaps as reformed, as Calvinist, as the members of Edward's Regency Council and the king himself. So, he is made to redraw the book, to rewrite it, and a second edition of the Book of Common Prayer comes out a few years later in 1552. So the first edition of the Book of Common Prayer, and you can see here we have the two title pages from the same printer. They've reused the same marginal decorations, they just changed the text. They haven't even bothered to redesign it because it was such a quick turnaround. Now, the first book preserved largely the ceremonial of the Catholic Mass. It said in the text for Holy Communion, it said an order for Holy Communion commonly known to the Mass. That word Mass is a big no-no for the Calvinists. They do not like it. They remind them of Catholic superstition, of what they see as popish or papist, and he is made to rewrite the liturgy. So the previous liturgy looks pretty much like a medieval Catholic Mass, as we saw in previous posts. This is a recreation that actually happened this year of a Mass according to the 1549 Book of Common Prayer at the Church of St. Bartholomew in London. I was lucky enough to attend it and to also photograph it. Some of my friends put it up. They're very cool people. They also sang a lot of ornamented polyphonic chant from that time. So basically, this is a time, a very short period of time, in which the Protestantization of the Church of England sort of goes on overdrive. And that involves also the mutilation of images, whether they be devotional or funerary. You can see that the figures of saints alongside this tomb, the tomb of Elizabeth de Montfort in Christ Church Cathedral, Oxford, from the same family as Simon de Montfort from previous lectures, has been defaced, mostly by people from Edward's time, as you saw in the picture, where he's tearing down the icons. And the Catholic Mass, which used to be very elaborate, has a lot of vestments and images, is pared down to a more Protestant Reformed, excuse the typo on the slide, Protestant Reformed service of Holy Communion, which doesn't have lavish vestments, where churches are whitewashed, where there are no images. In fact, there are tables with the commandments and scriptures that replace the images at the back, and the altar is replaced with a mere communion table. So the theology of these Protestants is that the Mass does not literally transform the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, a doctrine known as transubstantiation. and that the Mass is a reenactment of the sacrifice of Christ in Calvary. They merely say that it is an act of remembrance, a good thing that they were commanded to do by Christ, but that confers no special sacramental grace, that it is merely an act of commemoration. However, Edward doesn't reign for long. He has always been a sickly child. He is plagued by various diseases growing up. His father, ever so mindful of that, isolates him frequently, which is in fact why he is able to be educated so firmly in one direction of Protestantism, because not many people had access to Edward. And at the age of 15, in 1553, he is approaching death. He knows this, so he, with the aid of his counselors, but also drafting it in his own hand, draws up a device for his succession, a legal document outlining who should succeed him. Because the two other people next were his Catholic elder sister Mary, and his Protestant, though not as Protestant, youngest sister Elizabeth. So he doesn't want Mary to succeed him. He would see this as a catastrophe. She knows she's Catholic, and she's waiting to reverse all of the changes that he's done. So he writes in his own hand of a schoolboy, and you can see this document still preserved in the library, actually, of the inner temple of one of the Inns of Court, in which he changed his mind various times and crossed out various sentences. But he arrives at the fact that an obscure member of the extended royal family, someone who is related very distantly, Lady Jane Grey, and her heirs male should take over the throne. And now he initially said that it should be only her heirs male, her male heirs, her heirs of the body, but as he approaches death and she doesn't have any heirs, he crosses that out and says, okay, she's going to be queen. They also didn't want a female successor for dynastic reasons, obviously, for the same reason that Henry VIII wanted a male heir. And Lady Jane Grey is a very educated Protestant lady, like Catherine Parr, very much a Calvinist. And when Edward eventually dies, she is crowned queen, but famously reigns, though this is disputed whether she actually reigns or not, but she does have the support of the council, and she is crowned for 9 days. But Mary is mounting a rebellion in the north, which is the Catholic heartland of England. And over the course of those 9 days, she marches to London. All of the councillors abandon Jane Grey, and she seizes the throne and is crowned as Mary I, England's first undisputed female monarch, first queen regnant. Lady Jane Grey is initially kept as a friend of the Queen in the court, but her position and her being kept alive becomes increasingly untenable. She's the center of many conspiracies, and Mary, according to various historians, reluctantly allows her to be declared a traitor and executed. And this is just going to be the first of many more executions to come in Mary's reign. So this is a wonderful portrait by Anthony Moore from 1554, and as you can see, Mary is trying to firmly position herself as the heir of the Tudor dynasty. You see her holding a rose, like the portrait of Henry VII that we saw previously, and of various portraits like that of Henry VIII. This is powerful symbolism that is meant to unequivocally settle her as the heir of the Tudor dynasty. Now, she had a tough charge ahead of her. Though short, Edward's reign had been incredibly destructive in terms of infrastructure. Many churches had been whitewashed, their monuments had been destroyed, their incomes had been ransacked. Many of their priests had been outlawed or fled the realm. So she sets herself this charge of rebuilding England as a Catholic country. So there's a book about this change called The Voice of Morbath by Eamon Duffy. He also wrote a great book about the Reformation called The Stripping of the Altars. He traces the history of a church in the Church of St. George in Morbath in Devon, which through surviving records, we know that they are remaking rudimentarily, but eagerly, their old ornaments and images. They are taking back from storage the vestments that they hadn't given up. They had stored them because they thought, over this very unstable period, the pendulum might swing the other way. So England is largely very cooperative with Mary, because this sort of artificial Protestantization of the country imposed from the head of the country, from the king's government downward, was not very well received by most people, and it didn't really have enough time to cement itself. However, Mary does not give back the monastic lands. It is too far gone in that regard. The monasteries have been mutilated. New owners are already settled and powerful and unwilling to give these up. She does found a couple of new institutions, and she does say that she will found new monasteries, but most of the ancient monasteries are gone. And she also turns towards the clergy of Edward's England, especially to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, whom she has deposed from his position and replaced with the Catholic Cardinal Pole, who had fled England during Henry's reign, having refused to recognize him as supreme head of the church, and he's now, a member of the famous Pole family, who also threatened Henry with a stronger claim to the throne through the Plantagenets. But Pole is back in England, now is Archbishop, and Cranmer has been deposed. And now Mary becomes known through history as Bloody Mary. Many people might contest how deserving she is of that title, given that everyone in the Tudor period executed a bunch of people. But she gets that title from the numerous, more than 300, almost 400 executions of Protestants that happened during her reign. One of the most famous of these executions is that of Thomas Cranmer himself, with other figures of the reform movement of Edward. They are executed in 1556 in Oxford on Broad Street, a spot that you can still visit, where they are publicly burned. And famously, Mary managed to get Thomas Cranmer to recant his views and to say that he was wrong in captivity, which, under any normal circumstances, would have spared most traitors or most heretics who was being accused of heresy of being executed. If you were a reformed heretic, you were spared execution. But Mary hated Cranmer so much, because he had been the person who had declared the marriage of her father and her mother to be invalid, and who had declared her to be illegitimate and to be a bastard, that she decided that he must be executed anyway. And so on the day of his execution, as the flames were rising, Thomas Cranmer extended the hand with which he signed his confession and recantation, and he says, "Let this hand but burn first, because it hath sinned." And now this, and many other executions throughout the realm, inspire a movement, a sort of legend of martyrdom across all of these Protestants, which gets recorded later in a famous book that we're going to see in a bit, called John Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is where this woodcut actually comes from. Mary also moves to secure her own succession. And this she does by marrying Philip II of Spain, arguably one of the most Catholic monarchs in Europe. And now, Philip was famous for his Catholic demeanor and for his very somber attitude. He was a man that was very pious, attended several church services a day, dressed always all in black, like he were a Benedictine monk, though he never assumed holy orders. And he also commissioned the building of a combination monastery, palace, and royal mausoleum, the monastery of San Lorenzo de El Escorial in Spain. So this monastery is built atop a place called El Escorial, which means basically the garbage heap, because it was a spent iron mine, and escoria, which is slag, is sort of the unusable bits of metal that you get when mining and when smelting metal. And so this is a place, you can see, huge complex with a monastery church, various wings for the monks and for the king to live and hold court, and for his successors to be buried. It is still the primary burial site of the monarchs of Spain. It is still an active monastery, though not an active royal palace, and a great library. I have emailed with some of the monks there for image rights, and depending on who you get, they are more or less responsive to your emails and more or less kind. But that's beside the point. But yes, Philip and Mary, they marry, but they don't spend that much time together. They're both busy kings of their busy monarchs of their own kingdoms. Philip almost immediately goes back to Spain after marrying her. They spend very little time together, and they don't really manage to conceive a child, even though Mary, in many instances, believes that she is pregnant. She wants to be pregnant very, very much because the alternative to the succession is her Protestant sister Elizabeth. And again, this is a fear that all good Catholic changes that she had implemented, she saw them as good, would be undone. So she really, really wishes to be pregnant, and she has what is called a phantom pregnancy or a nervous pregnancy that never actually comes to fruition. Many scholars believe that she was also in a decline of mental health, cognitively. She was not in her best mood or thinking ability by the end of her reign because of all of these paranoias and the arguably very traumatic life that she led, being led away, prohibited from seeing her mother, declared illegitimate, sometimes imprisoned, and having to seize the crown. So, in 1558, scarcely 5 years after assuming the throne, Mary dies, probably of cancer, of a tumor, which might have also been mistaken for pregnancy. And here is, again, the title page of John Fox's Book of Martyrs. The name is Acts and Monuments, and it's basically a highly illustrated book of martyrdom stories from the Protestant cause and from other causes that becomes the bestseller book of Protestant England. And during the reign of Elizabeth, in fact, it is mandated that every single church should have a copy of the Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and John Fox's Book of Martyrs. So this is why Mary's legend as this sort of evil and murderous monarch gets perpetuated, even though other monarchs had executed just as many people, if not more, as she had. And her marriage with Philip also cements this sort of black legend of the Spaniards as the foremost enemies of England. In fact, it was a marriage that was resisted by some factions of the English court, but came through anyways. But that sort of fervent Catholicism of the Spaniards, coupled with his influence during Mary's reign to sort of purge the realm of Protestantism, really cemented that legend among Protestants. Now, after Mary dies, and even though she had been accused of treason and imprisoned, and later absolved, her half-sister Elizabeth assumes the throne in 1558. And this is a copy of her very famous coronation portrait done at about 1600. And now Elizabeth inherits a whole mess of a kingdom, you can argue, because it was a kingdom that had become soft Protestant, Catholic, but not following the Pope, and strongly Protestant, and strongly Catholic again. Now, the first thing that Elizabeth has to do in her reign is to work out a solution to the religious question of England. So she summons Parliament and tries to persuade the various factions at the House of Lords and in the House of Commons to arrive at a compromise. Now, what happens with the House of Lords? It is full of Catholic bishops. All of the bishops sitting in the House of Lords are Catholic. They are Mary appointees. And many of the nobles don't really want to change religion again. And they would prefer Catholicism to stay. The House of Commons, however, is more amenable to her cause. There are more Protestants there who are more willing to grant the Protestant concessions that she wishes. So they pass a new Act of Supremacy after much negotiation and many concessions to the more conservative elements, the more Catholic elements, in 1534, where she calls herself, the Act calls Elizabeth, the Supreme Governor, not the Supreme Head, the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, for several reasons. Calling oneself the head of the church is a problematic title on theological grounds, because Christ is supposed to be the head of the church, even if he's not physically on earth. That is one of his historic titles. So having someone usurp that, not even the Pope uses that title, was seen as rather far-reaching. But also because, and this is an issue for her time, an issue that she would overcome, but that would haunt her reign, because Elizabeth is a woman. And according to several interpretations of the Bible, especially the letters of St. Paul, women cannot be head over man. So she compromises for the title of governor, which still carries authority, but is not theologically contentious on any grounds, and she arrives at that compromise. It's not a very straightforwardly Protestant compromise. I mean, it takes a while for the Pope to actually officially condemn her. In 1570, 12 years into her rule, the Pope condemns her as a heretic, excommunicates her, and mandates her subjects to rebel and oppose against her with the bull Regnans in Excelsis. So she was trying to sort of appease both sides, despite the fact that she personally, we don't have many transparent portrayals of her own personal beliefs, but she was decidedly Protestant. Maybe not as Protestant as her brother had been, but Protestant enough to deny transubstantiation. Now, in the new Act of Uniformity, which is passed in the same year, 1559, as the previous Act of Supremacy, there is the establishment of a new Book of Common Prayer. And uniformity is a great way in which to characterize Elizabeth's religious settlement, because she's not interested in everyone believing the same thing. She's interested in everyone worshiping uniformly, and to them displaying outward conformity to the rules that she has laid down, to the liturgies, to the forms of prayer. There's a famous quote that is often attributed to her, which says that she doesn't wish to make windows into men's souls. Now, both the Catholics in Rome and the Protestants in Geneva and other parts of Europe were very much concerned with every single person not only worshipping as they should, but believing certain very specific things. So this sets apart Anglicanism as a form of Protestantism that does not prioritize that inward belief as much as outward conformity. And it's a feature that would characterize the Church for the rest of its history, and that it still, to some extent, does today. So the new prayer book is very latitudinarian. It gives various options in terms of interpretation of rubrics for worship and also theological statements. So, for example, to satisfy some of the conservative elements, she allows them, with the ornaments rubric, to still wear many of the vestments that were previously worn during the Catholic Mass. However, it is very careful not to call the Mass the Mass. It just calls it a service of Holy Eucharist, and whoever wants to interpret it as a Mass could, but it was on paper a Protestant service of Holy Communion. And in the end, this does not satisfy the Catholics. And she recognizes that she needs to pack her council and pack the realm with more Protestant advisors. So William Cecil, famously, is her most trusted advisor. Afterwards, his son Robert Cecil will succeed him, and Francis Walsingham is also a great advisor. Francis Walsingham is famously her spy master. He weaves a network of spies to detect and foil, sometimes fabricate, Catholic plots against her. And she does, in the end of her reign, identify herself as a firmly Protestant queen. A Protestant queen that is tolerant, a Protestant queen that is theologically ambiguous, but a Protestant queen nonetheless. So, a lot of the Catholic bishops appointed by Mary start to die off, as she appoints them with Protestant replacements. But a lot of the ones that hang on are made to either sign an oath recognizing her as governor of the Church of England, or they are deprived of their offices and their benefices. So she kicks out all of the remaining Catholic bishops and replaces them with Protestant loyalists. And this happens throughout her government. Her government is a decidedly Protestant-run affair. In 1563, a convocation is drawn up to establish and outline more principles to firmly ground this Church of England theologically as possible, as it had been a bit too ambiguous for the Protestants as well. They settle on drawing up the 39 Articles, which is one of your handouts today. We might get to discuss them at the end, we might not, we shall see. So it's a joint parliament and church council, and it was organized by Elizabeth's new Archbishop of Canterbury, who was Matthew Parker. And its aim was to sort of define, as I said previously, specifically the beliefs that would anchor the theology and the practice of the Church of England. It's not easy. After 8 years, the Articles are passed in 1571 and included in the prayer books. And the Articles represent a decisive break with Rome, a very explicit one, as one of the Articles states that the Pope's jurisdiction in England is no longer valid or recognized. The Bishop of Rome hath no jurisdiction in this realm of England. And these are Articles that are still in force in the Church of England. Yes?
It's kind of a silly question, but like 1 or 2 slides ago, when they were showing the whole cabinet, all the religious figures have letters on their robes. What does that mean?
Oh, letters.
The Parliament, rather. Sorry.
That's sort of labeling. So I cut out the caption of the image, but that's just labeling for the description of the woodcut. But this is a very interesting image, and one that I should have explained before. So there she is sitting at the House of Lords, which is the house in which the monarch presides over Parliament as a close kin of the nobility. And you can see the nobles of the House of Lords are sitting on the woolsacks, and behind a bar are the members of the Commons. So when you open Parliament, you hold a session, kind of like a joint session of Congress, where both the House of Lords and the House of Commons sit in the same chamber and they listen to a speech by the monarch. The Lords are seated in their place and the Commons are standing behind the bar to sort of delimit that sort of historic division between the houses. Is that a good answer?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's go back. So, among other articles, it is outlined that the Articles outline, the 39 Articles outline, that the scriptures contain everything that's necessary for salvation, so no more tradition, no more magisterium or teaching of the Pope and the bishops, and that there are only two sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist. The other five are not recognized, though some Anglicans, this would develop in time, but have a changing position on whether they're sacraments. Some people call them the sacraments of the Church as opposed to the sacraments of the Gospel, which are instituted by Christ, baptism and Eucharist. But at this point, they're not recognized as sacraments. And the articles also defend clerical marriage, which is not permitted in the Catholic Church, still isn't. Priests have to be celibate and unmarried, and reaffirm the monarch's governorship of the Church. And they also publish a book of homilies, which is a set of pre-approved sermons that parish priests had to or could deliver, and certain occasions they had to deliver them, that were firmly rooted in sort of Matthew Parker's synthesis of Anglican Protestant theology. In many ways, this is very handy. A problem throughout the Middle Ages is that priests are either too lazy or don't have enough time, or they're not literate enough. There were illiterate priests in the Middle Ages, especially in rural areas, and they can't write sermons. So they've always had a series of pre-written sermons. This is not that innovative, but the fact that they are written in English and that they were Protestant, that's what's important. Yeah, if you have a book of homilies, you don't have to worry about writing your own sermon and accidentally being a heretic when you write it. Now, in terms of law, you will observe that Elizabeth is still acting within the bounds of what is established as English law now. You can see this is sort of an initial from a charter promulgated by Elizabeth. They're still adhering to this medieval aesthetic of legal documents, which calls back to the ancient legitimacy of English law and the Constitution. But she also uses Parliament, and she uses all of the established institutions to make her changes permanent. She doesn't try to rule in the French manner, as Henry VII did. She tries to get these changes passed through the institutions that have been outlined in the historic English Constitution, partly because as a female monarch, she recognizes that her legitimacy could be called into question at any point, and also the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who was variously regarded to have been a disreputable woman, and she had been declared to be a bastard of Anne Boleyn at various times. So there are various preoccupations with the legitimacy of Elizabeth's succession. So she sticks to these true, tried, and tested instruments of legitimacy within the English law. She faces a number of challenges during her reign. So famously, her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, is seen by her Catholic detractors as the true legitimate heir of England, as she is next in the line of succession, and she is, of course, Catholic. So there are many, many Catholic plots to try and replace Elizabeth with Mary. Now, Mary was facing her own troubles in Scotland. Scotland was also undergoing its own independent, more Calvinist Reformation. She was forced to abdicate, and she sought refuge in England. When she sought refuge in England, she was effectively captured and kept prisoner at a series of castles under Elizabeth's government. But when Francis Walsingham discovers that there has been a plot, and that Mary was involved in correspondence in this plot, which planned to kill Elizabeth, put Mary as queen, and re-establish Catholicism in England. When evidence of this is uncovered, the council advises Elizabeth to press charges for treason and to have her executed. Now, Elizabeth absolutely does not want to do this. It seems counterintuitive, having a strong claimant to your already shaky position as queen, both being a woman and the daughter of a disputed marriage. But the problem with this, and this harkens back to our ideas of kingship being a sacred office is that Mary is also an anointed and consecrated queen. And this does imbue her with a status, with a power that cannot be easily violated. And Elizabeth knows that if she does go ahead and execute Mary, she might undermine her own position as an anointed and consecrated queen. She might break the sacred element of queenship, of kingship in England. She agonizes over this decision. She probably also has some compassion for who was her cousin and who she thought was more sympathetic to her than she actually was, maybe. She agonizes over this and she reluctantly signs the death warrant. She gives it to an advisor, but she tells the advisor not to give it to her council. The advisor refuses the order. She gives it to the council, and they erect a scaffold at Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire, and they execute her. Elizabeth is not present at the execution. She's not present at the trial. She wants to be removed from this process as much as possible. Many historians speculate that this is to distance herself and her own actions from the blood that was spilled. Blood that was sacred, blood that should not have been spilled, blood of a consecrated queen. Another issue comes from her former brother-in-law, half-brother-in-law, Philip II, who, even though he proposed marriage to her when she ascended to the throne, obviously she refused him, was now plotting an invasion of England to re-Catholicize the country. What became known as the Spanish Armada in 1588. The execution of Mary was in 1587. Spanish Armada was in 1588. So Philip amasses a huge number of ships. He builds and builds a new fleet. He has the authorization of the Pope and of various other elements in the Spanish Church. And he launches an invasion to England. The invasion is unsuccessful for various reasons. The sailors were not at all experienced with the turbulent currents and weather of the English Channel. And the English themselves, led by famous sailors such as Francis Drake, a pirate who then became a privateer, an officially sanctioned pirate from her reign, used the tactic of fire ships, of crashing ships on fire into the densely packed fleet of the Spaniards so that all of the ships would burn in flames. And so, on the eve of the invasion, Elizabeth, many accounts say that she was wearing armor on the coasts with the army ready to take on the invading Spanish host if they made it to the land. She gives a very inspiring speech known as the Tilbury speech, and one of its lines is, though I am a weak and feeble woman, those are her words, I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. In fact, throughout her reign, she uses that language extensively. She calls herself king. She sort of tries to shy away from her physical femaleness and really argues for herself as just as good as the king of England. This takes us to our next stage of Elizabeth's reign, which is the creation of a whole legend and a whole mythos around Elizabeth, the so-called Virgin Queen. So Elizabeth, though she had reputedly a lover, Robert Dudley, we don't have any evidence that they actually were lovers, but she was certainly fond of him, never married him for various complicated reasons. He was already married, he was too lowly in the nobility scale, and despite various suitors having been proposed to her, among them Duke of Anjou in France, princes from the Holy Roman Empire, and so on and so forth, she denies all of them. She refuses to be married, even though her council really wants her to be married because they want a successor to the throne. Now, she doesn't want to be married because she doesn't want to be undermined by a husband. But also, she doesn't want to be undermined by an heir. She doesn't want people to just wait out or conspire further to get someone else on the throne if she were to have a child. So she cultivates this image of virginity. In a country that had been dispossessed or stripped of its worshipping or veneration of the Virgin Mary, she sort of assumes the role of a Virgin Mary-like figure. Not really. She doesn't claim to be the mother of God or anything, but she assumes imagery of fair and white skin, which she achieves with a heavy use of white lead makeup, which would later poison her, and with elaborate costumes and dresses and gowns, and most crucially, portraits. Various portraits of Elizabeth are painted this time. Not just one that is distributed to everyone, various versions of the same person, different outfits and different poses with different attributes. But one thing seems to be constant. It's her face. Many scholars believe that artists were issued with an official facial template, a sort of like drawing of her face, that no matter what they used, they could dress her up in any magnificent gown and magnificent setting, they had to use that same face. So she standardized her image as a virgin queen and used dress and portraiture as powerful tools to convey her power as queen. Now, this is one of the most famous portraits. It's called the Rainbow Portrait, and she is shown as this sort of ageless, otherworldly figure. She looks very fair, even though this is around 1600, in which she was around 60 years of age. And it's called the Rainbow Portrait because she's holding a rainbow, which has faded in color over time. But look at her dress. What is her dress adorned with? But if not eyes and ears. Eyes and ears to let you know that she sees all and that she hears all, despite being a feeble woman, despite being perhaps illegitimate. She is the queen. She has a ring of spies. She has executed many Catholics, and she could execute you if she wanted to, and if you crossed her. There is various legal language used around her time to express the position that she occupied. Plowden, a very notable jurist of the time, elaborates the doctrine of kingship as being one of two bodies. So the king, he says, and this is something that has been believed in the Middle Ages for a long time, but comes to be very much explicitly articulated in Elizabethan law. The king has two bodies. One that is feeble, mortal, that is susceptible to the infirmities of life, so it can die, it can get sick, and so on and so forth. But also, and this is called the body natural of the king. Sorry about that. The body natural, which is feeble and can become sick and can die. And another body, the body politic, which is immortal. It is ageless. It is incorruptible and passes down from king to king. So she leans in to her possession and to her embodiment of the body politic of the realm. More so than any other king or queen before her. This is also a great time for theatre in England and in London. This is the time in which Shakespeare and various other playwrights like Marlowe, one of his rivals, flourish. Not only in the theatres in London, like the Globe. Here is the reconstruction of the Globe that we've talked about before in London, but also the theatre of the Inns of Courts. Now, Elizabeth's reign was a reign of great censorship, as you might see, because of her precarious position, because of her religious conformity agenda, and because of her propaganda. And this involved the theater, and particularly, and by the way, Elizabeth would have never attended a play in one of these theaters, unlike the movie Shakespeare in Love suggests. There's this big scene at the end of the movie where she reveals himself and she's in the theater. That would have never happened. Plays were performed at court, but often the same players that performed here would be brought to court to perform. But there's a lot of censorship. Famously, the play Richard II of Shakespeare is modified because it includes a scene where Richard II is ritually stripped of his kingly status, as we saw with Henry Bolingbroke deposing him. Apparently he did so Hilary Boulter with a happy face. But Shakespeare dramatizes this moment as sort of a coronation in reverse, where he gets stripped of every single element of kingship and very sort of explicitly is made to see, it states that, this can be done, a king can be stripped of it. Elizabeth has none of that. That cannot be shown in her reign because it suggests that she could be deposed. But she was very fond of plays. She attends many of them at her own court, many of the plays by Shakespeare, which was a member of a theater troupe called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and then the King's Men under Elizabeth's successor. And Parliament in 1566 officially censors the press. And this sort of censorship stays in place for much of the early modern period. The press is particularly censored, and the chief censor of the press is the Bishop of London. So you had to publish a book, the Bishop of London or his people had to read it because of the printing center of England was in London. So she was also regulating the printed press. But there was a group that was very hard to censor, and she really couldn't censor, which was the amateur play artists at the Inns of Court. They put plays at holiday seasons often. And as we saw in previous lectures, they satirized elements of the law, of their lives as lawyers, or of current events, as I would say. It was sort of the Saturday Night Live of the time. So they improvised them, they did it. And she liked to attend these plays. Everyone at Westminster does attend these plays. But often they criticize her, precisely because of her policies and because of her refusing to marry. So several of the plays of the Inns of Court allude to this. They never stated explicitly, but they allude to the fact that the Queen should marry, that the Queen's duty is to secure succession and to have an heir. And this, though it causes her great displeasure, there's no great way to censor these. They are lawyers, they're supposed to have a latitude of freedom of speech. So she merely protests and leaves whenever such an offensive play is put on. Now, the question of the succession was in everyone's mind as the 16th century drew to a close. The Queen reigned for 44 years. It was a long reign, far longer than any of her two predecessors, Mary or Edward. And she was approaching the age of 69. She was ill, she was pockmarked, she had survived about a smallpox, and she was slowly, though they didn't know this at the time, being poisoned by her toxic makeup. She also grows a bit melancholic. Because of her long life, many of her close confidants, including William Cecil and many of her friends, start to die, which causes her immense grief, and she's depicted in white, the color of virginity, of divinity, of angels. She still pushes this image towards the end. And this is very similar, as you can see, to the triumphal Armada portrait, in which she also has her hand on the globe next to the crown, next to the victory of the Armada, and next to her very elaborate costume. As Elizabeth grows frail, she refuses to name an heir. Her counselors really want her to do so. It would secure a stable succession, something that England has had trouble with for the past couple or so successions. She refuses to do so because of the same reasons. She wants to keep everyone on her toes. She wants to keep her position as firmly as possible. And on her final days, she withdraws to one of her palaces, where she falls sick, increasingly frail, refuses to lie down. She stands for hours and hours until she collapses in a floor that had been laid out with cushions by her aides. And Elizabeth dies in 1603. Her counselors quickly maneuver to appoint their own successor, which they agree should be Mary, Queen of Scots' son, James. James was raised a Protestant, so it was not an issue in terms of his religion, and he, for some time, had been covertly maneuvering with elements of Elizabeth's court to secure his place as a successor. He had been King of Scotland for a number of years now. And I would like to conclude this lecture, we have about 5 minutes left, with a few reflections on her reign. I think, and many scholars think, that Elizabeth was successful for a number of ways. First, because she reigned for such a long time, for 44 years, when both of her predecessors scarcely made the 5-year mark and had a combined reign of less than 10 years. And because she was really good at being a political survivor and at compromise. Something that neither Edward, being a child and being very Protestant himself, and Mary, being a staunch Catholic who wanted to right the wrongs done to her mother, could not do. So she allowed herself to be transformed, to not reveal the innermost thoughts of her faith, to be open to accommodate certain views that she saw as not easily dispelled in her kingdom, and to transform what was perhaps her biggest weakness, her female sex, into one of her greatest strengths through a great program of propaganda and of allegory that exploited the most ancient and most powerful legal, theological, and artistic resources of her time. And the thing that Elizabeth gave to England, at long last, was a somewhat stable reign. A reign where people could go on practicing their religion as they were, where there were no abrupt changes of leadership, of faith, which is why in many cases this is sort of called England's sort of like Renaissance golden age. There was a lot of literary flourishing, there was a lot of enrichment, which we will talk more about in the next lecture, largely centered around wool. But it was arguably a time of prosperity, mostly through stability that the kingdom had lacked for a long time. And this is a later portrait of Elizabeth, done perhaps after her life, most certainly, because publishing a portrait of the Queen where she is obviously haunted by death and Father Time could be deemed treasonous. But it sort of also tells us about the perception of her at the end of her reign. She's a bit tired. She has done a lot. She has put up a big fight, but she's ready to go. And you can see the angels hovering above her holding a crown, and it just makes me wonder whether they're holding the crown above her head, lowering it, or taking it away, because she's about to die. Alright, that was the lecture for today. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions about what we saw today? Or about any